like to invite Mr. Yashwant Sinha, former Minister of Finance and External Affairs, Government of India. Thank you, sir.
A very unlikely person to talk to a group of socialists and Democrats. But when George Matthew telephoned me and I was literally deep in the jungles of a state called Jharkhand, which is my state, I just couldn't have said no, because it was George Matthew calling about George Fernandes. And I'm glad I'm here with you this evening. You have spent 2 days discussing some very vital issues of importance to not only India and Asia, but the rest of the world. And I'm quite sure the outcome of this conference will not merely lead to another conference, but will be absorbed by people who are interested in this subject, and the subject is such that all of us are interested in this. My association with George, as has been pointed out, started on a personal basis when I joined public life way back in 1984. And I was delighted to meet George Fernandes. I'm not going to take your time after that very detailed summation of his political life, but I remember one thing, that George was contesting a by-election in a vast, sprawling constituency in Bihar called Banka. And he was very keen that I should become his election manager. And the president of the party, Mr. Chandrasekhar, acceded to the request of George Fernandes and deputed me to go and camp at Banka and help George conduct the election. Now, all of us who have gone through the electoral process know that the most important day of the election is actually the day on which the polls are held. And all of us are absolutely alert on that day, isn't it, Mr. Ratha? You know, we are all up and about, ready to plunge into whatever is not to our liking, and we handle the phones, we are calling people all the time, taking reports. That's the polling day. And of course, there could also be violence. There could be malpractices. That's something which has to be tackled. But I was very surprised that on the day of the poll, traditionally, George Fernandes, and he contested many elections, he used to sleep through the day. He used to sleep through the day. And the previous evening, he called me and he told me, you have to take care of everything. I just would not be available. And even if the heavens fell, don't come and wake me up. So, I mean, heavens didn't fall, but a lot of other bad things happened. But none of us had the courage to go and wake up George. He woke up only in the evening. And the second thing which I noticed about him was, he never went to the counting hall. All of us go to the counting halls to know firsthand what the results, how the results are coming out. George never went to the counting hall. He stayed at home and would get to know the results as and when they came. Some very interesting aspects of his life. There are many more, but I will not take your time on this. I'm very happy that you have discussed some very pertinent issues relating to democracy in this two-day seminar. As for me, there can't be any democracy without participation. So I think on that there is enough consensus that democracy has to be participatory. The only point which I'd like to make is that it is not, participation should not merely mean that you go and vote once in a while, once in 4 years, once in 5 years. Participation means participation in the decision-making process. And how do you ensure, let's say in a country like India, 1.2 billion people, how do you ensure that the citizens, the voters participate in the decision-making process? Through the representatives, but sometimes the representatives also have they are at a distance from the electorate. So therefore, democracy has to be taken down to the people. In order to make democracy participatory, democracy has to be taken to the grassroots. And we have the ancient system in India called the Panchayati Raj. And I'm very glad that George Matthew has organized seminars on the efficacy of Panchayati Raj system in India, where you have local bodies, right down to the one or a group of villages. And people are taking or are supposed to take decisions. It is very imperfect, despite the fact that the amendments came in the 80s, but we have not given our local bodies enough powers, and therefore democracy at this level remains very imperfect. What we need to do is to give real powers, including financial powers, to our institutions at the local level and enable them to discharge their responsibilities. I have always wondered why one elected representative in this country who is the Prime Minister will have can have his finger on the nuclear button, but at the village level, at the panchayat level, you will not trust an elected representative about where the village well should be dug. I mean, this is a contradiction which is unacceptable, and clearly we need to do much more, even in India, as far as participatory democracy is concerned. The second, of course, is inclusion, and everyone agrees. Again, there is no lack of consensus that without inclusion, there cannot be a successful or a strong democracy. And inclusion is not merely political inclusion, economic inclusion, financial inclusion, to me, is more important, because if you are excluded economically, you are marginalized economically, you are also marginalized politically. But it is actually on the question of rights that there has been a lot of debate, and there are a lot of contentious issues on the question of rights. And if I were to surprise you by saying, because I have spent, as was mentioned here, almost all my life in government. I was a civil servant, then I came into public life, I joined a political party, and I have been a member of parliament, I have been a member of the state legislature, I have been a minister. And based on my experience, not on my scholarship, I would like to say that the greatest threat to the citizens' right comes from the state. State, which includes all the organs of the state, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and to that I will add the civil society and the media. Because whether we like it or not, today civil society and media are part of the governance process. And with all due respect to civil society activists, I would like to say that the threat to individual liberty, to freedom, comes mostly from the state. And if the state could be democratically elected. I mean, Hitler is not the only example of a leader who got democratically elected and then extinguished the democracy. The threat to democracy, to human rights, to citizens' rights is largely from democratically elected leaders and governments. And if you were to accept my advice will be, first, watch out against the state. We have to ensure that the state remains within its defined limits and does not impinge on the rights of the citizens. Social contract is dead. There is no social contract. And therefore, I will go back to Jayaprakash Narayan. Because Jayaprakash Narayan advocated a non-state actor, not in terms of the new terrorist outfits, but a non-state powerful body of citizens which will act as a watchdog on the state. In a democracy where we don't have, and I'm not merely referring here, for the Indians present here will understand, merely to the Lokpal. Lokpal will also be a part of the state. I am referring to a strong, continuous people's movement, which will be symbolized by some very dedicated people. And they will be acting as a check on the excesses of the state. In a democracy where this is missing, we'll have democracy in form, we'll have elections, we'll have governments, but the citizens' rights will not be safe. Then rise of extremism, we are all aware, is something which enables the state to extinguish people's rights. I come from a state which is a victim of left-wing extremism. And I'm personally aware of the excesses which are committed by both sides, the police by the day and the extremist by the night, as is popularly said. So nobody is safe. Nobody's rights are safe. And they are actually suffering because of this assault on their freedom, day in and day out. Often it leads to brutality. Some acts of violence which are as barbaric as the acts of the ISIS in the Middle East. And it is at times, it is this lapse or relapse into brutality which leaves me absolutely amazed as to why in this modern day and age people can be so brutal to each other and commit atrocities in such a barbaric fashion. Where is democracy? You go and ask somebody, person is killed, he's gone, but somebody who's been brutalized, somebody who's been maimed, somebody who's been disabled, ask him about human rights. What right does he have? And we are all aware, I mean, we are sitting here, we are very happy, we are discussing democracy, but go and ask the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda and Burundi what happened to them in the early 70s. Go and ask the ethnic groups in Darfur or in the south of Sudan even now what's happening to their human rights. The point I'm making is most of us remain indifferent to massive genocides which are still taking place somewhere or the other in the world. And it is this indifference which is threatening democracy, human rights, humanity itself. Religion is a threat, and that's why we have the famous theory of secularism. But in India, some of the most rabid castists are the biggest champions of secularism. If secularism is liberalism, it's a liberal state of mind, and you say, I will not permit my mind to be vitiated by religious considerations, then how do you allow your mind to be vitiated by the narrow divides of caste in our system? And this is one of the points, as far as Indian democracy is concerned, the role of caste in electoral politics. Though I always regarded myself as an honorable exception, because I couldn't have won my elections on the basis of caste. But these are contradictions which constrict the democratic spirit, even in a country like India, where we are very proud of our democratic traditions. Now, the military has been a threat to democracy in many parts of Asia. Even today it is. Many parts of the world, particularly in Asia. But I am not so much surprised that the military has been a threat, that the military has extinguished democracies in many countries of Asia. What has surprised me is the attitude of the Western democracies to military dictatorships. And I remember a visit I was making to London as Minister for External Affairs of the Government of India. And I was meeting with some very honorable and distinguished British members of Parliament. And I was absolutely shocked when they were trying to justify before me a military dictatorship in Pakistan. And when I said, you are the birthplace of modern democracy, how can you justify military dictatorship? And they said, no, the democratically elected people were all very corrupt. And I said, if we have corruption in the UK, would you then agree that UK should be taken over by a military general? But clearly, there is some duplicity here. And people will be very happy doing business with military dictators in one country, and will not only condemn and ostracize a military dictator somewhere else, but will also come down heavily on other countries which might be democracies, but which prefer to deal with that military dictator. And a clear case here is Myanmar or Burma and Pakistan. I will compliment the Commonwealth of Nations, the British Commonwealth of Nations, that they have a rule under which if democracy is attacked or diminished or finished or ended in a country, then that country loses the membership or it's suspended from the membership of the Commonwealth. But United Nations has no such law, no such rule. And my own fear is that if the Western democracies, in their own perceived national interest, continue to make this differentiation in their approach and continue to be as comfortable with military dictatorships, or perhaps more comfortable with military dictatorships than they are with democracies. You know, you can have any large number of conferences on democracy. Democracy will not be safe in the developing world. The other great threat to democracy is again from democratic regimes. And that is the question of regime change and imposition of democracy from outside. Can you really establish democracy from above, from the outside in a country? Will such a democracy ever last? And the Middle East, the countries in the Middle East are going to show this. In no small measure, the rise of the extremists there, the terrorists, can be ascribed in no small measure to the policies which some of the leading countries have followed in that area. And therefore, this whole concept of imposing democracy from the outside has to be dismissed lock, stock, and barrel. It's like the white man's burden of earlier times and cannot be acceptable to the rest of the world. Democracy will always face problems. And I remember what I read a long time ago about a traveler who was going to the US and picked up a US newspaper, and it had all the news on front pages of strikes, industrial strikes, of rapes, of murders, of this, that, and the other. And he said, oh my God, what kind of country I'm going to? Then the same person was traveling to the Soviet Union, and he picked up a Soviet Union paper. And the news was, oh, great advances in productivity of labor, you know, great advances in science, and everything is hunky-dory, and there is complete peace. And we all know what happened to the Soviet Union and what has happened to the US. To me, the problems of democracy will always be there, but in order to tackle those problems and solve those problems,